Welcome to our weekly meditation and mindfulness class. Let's begin this week with a meditation. So let's find our comfortable seated position and we can close our eyes now. Start feeling into our body, feeling into our seat, feeling our feet touching the earth, feeling the hips stacked over the legs, the chest stacking above the hips. Let's roll our shoulders up to the ears and down and back, keeping them soft and relaxed while we sit. And then we can stack the neck over the shoulders, slightly tuck the chin, reach with the crown of the head up to the sky. So let's begin with a relaxation technique now. So let's inhale. As you exhale, imagine a wave of relaxation washing down our body. And inhale once more. And on each exhale, just imagine this wave of relaxation coursing down the body, starting at the top of the head, moving through the face, relaxing the eyes, relax the jaw, relax the neck, relax the shoulders, relax the ribs, relax the hips, relax the legs. Just keep doing that, inhaling a deep, full breath, and then exhaling this wave of relaxation coursing down your body. And you can continue doing that for the entire meditation, or if you grow tired of that, and if you feel very still, you can just sit in stillness and allow your senses to withdraw into your core. And maybe after a while you feel like you're just floating there. So let's do that now. Let's start with that relaxation technique. And if you find yourself really still, then just sit in the stillness and allow your senses to withdraw. Let's slowly start to deepen our inhale, bringing awareness back into the body. Opening your eyes when you feel ready to join us. So, what do you think of that technique? Any thoughts? Any questions? Impressions?
Well, I felt very relaxed. But when you said to withdraw your senses, um, in some ways, I feel like certain of my senses get heightened when I'm in that state. Like my hearing, I hear things that when I'm not meditating and I'm busy, I don't hear. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to fully. I mean, I've had the experience of drawing in and not having my senses, but usually my hearing and maybe even just smells get a little more heightened. So I'm just curious how to how to draw your senses in
Sure. Well,
more.
that's why I said just allow your senses to withdraw. You can't really force it. It's just, I found that sometimes it just starts to kind of happen on its own when you allow space for it. Um, when when you become really still, it's kind of just happens sometimes. And so yeah, you can't really force it to happen. And I think that's natural to become more aware of your surroundings as you quiet the mind. I think that's just kind of one of the stages you go through. And so yeah, don't worry about it if the withdrawing of the senses doesn't happen. Just well, if you maybe if you keep up with it over time, you might notice that it starts to happen. But um, it's I don't know, it's not something to strive for or struggle for. It's just one possible technique. I don't it's something that often works for me. But um, yeah, but yeah, you can't really force it, and don't worry about it if you're more aware of hearing things. That's all good.
So would you say that if you can withdraw and let your senses kind of mute, is that maybe the next level deeper in a meditation?
Um, you could call it that. I mean, I hate using things like levels, and because it makes it seem like there's something you're trying to achieve, which kind of goes against the point. But I think that that does kind of just happen naturally over time as you spend more time meditating and becoming still. Just I think just naturally over time you might start to notice that happening where your senses start to just kind of withdraw on their own, and you might start to just feel like you're just kind of floating there in a bubble in space. I don't know. That's what happens to me sometimes, but only when I'm really still and really quiet. So just, I don't know, something not really to strive for, but or I guess not really, um, I don't know, just keep that in the back of your mind, maybe. But yeah, don't try to force yourself to do it or anything. Or don't worry if it's not happening or anything. But yeah, I don't know. I
Got
just
it.
throw that out there.
I always like it if the monkey mind slows down or
Mm,
even stops, God forbid, occasionally. And then when it does, the senses are there a little more acute, and that's fine with me. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that does happen naturally. As you relax and slow down the mind, you do become more aware of your senses. And that's one of the nice things about meditating and also pursuing a mindful life. I think the more time you spend after years of a meditative practice, you do become more sensitive to everything, which is a good and a bad thing.
Yeah.
But, yeah, great. I'm just gonna. There's a heater running over here. And it's getting quite warm, so I think I'm gonna go turn that off. All right. So there was one topic I wanted to talk about tonight, and that is confronting fear. So we've been talking about this quite a bit over the past few weeks about addressing our emotions, facing our emotions, and processing them. And so I thought I could share an example from my personal life that I just went through this past week. So it started last week. We had that cold weather, and my phone battery started acting up. Like, it started dying as soon as I unplugged it. And so I thought it's time to get a new phone, because I've had this one for a few years now, and you know how the batteries start to go after a while. So I tried to order a new phone, and I ordered a new phone, and I thought it was all set. But then Monday morning, I get this email saying your order has been successfully canceled. I was like, what? And that was all it said, right? No additional information. And so I logged on to the company that I bought it from. It's my cell phone provider. It's one of those prepaid companies. It's called Net10. It's not one of the big wireless providers. I started using them when I was traveling a lot because I didn't want an $80 Verizon bill when I was out of the country. But I've kept using them because they're cheap, and it still works fine. I mean, it's still perfectly good cell service, and it's only $20 a month, so I kept using it. Um, but but sometimes, like, some of their processes and communications aren't that great, and this phone order thing was one of the things. So I log on, I start chatting with the support guy, and he says, "Oh, we don't have any record of this order. You'll have to talk to this other company called Total Wireless," which I'd never heard of before, and I wasn't aware I'd ordered it from them. But I'm like, okay. So that was a little bit frustrating. So it's like confusing, what's going on with this. So I log on to the other company's website and start chatting with the customer service rep there, and she's also like, we have no record of this order, even though I had the order number and everything. And so that's when I kind of like lost it. I got really angry and really frustrated. And well, I kept it in check. I didn't say anything too rude. I just said, well, at one point I was like, is this a real company? And then she was like, so do you want to retry ordering again? And I was like, don't bother. And I closed the browser window, and I was all in a huff. Um, and so then I started work and went through the rest of my day. But then later that day, I started thinking about it, and I was like, why did I get so angry about that? Because I was really upset in the moment, and really, I wasn't thinking straight, and just really, really upset about it. And it kind of seemed um, disproportionately upset compared to what was going on. It was just a mix up with my phone order, but I was like really angry in the moment. And so I started thinking about that, started sitting with that, and kind of examining why I got so angry. So I started replaying the events in my mind. And so that morning, the morning had started off well. I had a nice meditation in the morning, and then I wrote for an hour like I usually do. But then before I was going to start working at my job, there was a whole bunch of emails. And one of them was that phone order email. Another one was an email from this woman that I'm talking to about renting a little studio house that's on their property. And that's been a whole kind of process because, it's a separate structure on their property. So she wants to find a good fit, and she's just been very thorough with the whole process. And it's been fine, but just it's taken quite a while, and she's just very thorough. But so as I started, so that email, it also came through and also kind of triggered something in me too that I hadn't been previously aware of, because that brought up this whole thing about how I'm thinking about settling here, and I'm starting to look for places to live. And so I'm thinking about taking on a lease and locking myself into a monthly rental payment, and which is going to be a lot more money than what I'm paying at the RV park now. And so it started, it's tapping into all these kind of uncertainties about money. And so my expenses are going to be going up, but at the same time I want to work less so that I can spend more time developing the Abbey, the Redwoods. And so there's kind of been this fear developing in the back of my mind that I haven't wanted to look at so far. I've kind of been ignoring it. And um, and so I think, and tied up in that, we've been having a lot of technical difficulties with trying to do stuff for the Abbey, trying to get our videos going and things like that. And so there's been kind of a general frustration with technology going on with me. And then it's also kind of tied up with the Abbey and my future and this fear about money. And so I think what happened is that there's been this kind of fear developing that I haven't wanted to face. And then when this minor frustration came up with the phone order, it all of a sudden just kind of like, all this pent up fear came out through anger that I directed at this poor innocent woman on the customer service woman on the other end of the chat line. And so I'm like, wow, that's interesting. So I started digging into that fear more, right? Trying to understand what was making me uncomfortable, was making me scared, was making me feel uncomfortable. And it's kind of as I tried to kind of pull on that thread, right, try to get a little bit deeper, figure out what's really going on with me. I started figuring out that there's a whole lot of fear tied up, right, or there's some fear in my life right now because I'm in this place now where I have this opportunity to follow my dreams and be a part of this spiritual community and be a yoga teacher and a meditation teacher. But it's uncertain about the future of the Abbey, whether or not we're going to be able to make this into a sustainable community. And 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 I'm also tying my personal future up in with this, and so there's a lot of fear about that. And I think so at the root of it is this fear that if I devote myself, if I pour my heart and my time and energy into developing the Abbey, and it fails, it doesn't work out, then then I'll wasted all this time and burn through my savings, and I'll be nowhere, right? I'll be back at the drawing board. So, and that's just something I have to, a possibility that I have to acknowledge is possible, and just be aware that that is a possibility. And I hadn't wanted to admit this to myself, right? That's why I was just kind of like looking away from it. Every time a little bit of fear came up, I would just say to myself, well, everything will work out exactly the way it's supposed to. I think, like we talked about in the discussion on faith a couple of weeks ago, that's something that I believe, truly I feel and I believe that things do work out exactly the way they're supposed to. But I was using that to kind of to repress my fear, to not look at my fear, and which is counterproductive in the long run. And so, in the end, I was repressing this fear, and then it bubbled over in this anger directed at this totally unrelated person. And so I think that happens to a lot of us in a lot of different situations. I think there's a lot of that going on in the country right now with politics. There's a lot of fear about the pandemic. I mean, everything's kind of up in the air right now. The rules are totally changing, and leading up to the election, it seemed like our democracy was perhaps under threat even. And so I think we're all dealing with a lot of fear, and we're not trained very well to address our fear, to face our fear. I think we all kind of grow up in this culture where we're not really honest with our fears. We just try to ignore them, or any negative emotions. We're just taught to kind of ignore them, or most people are. Maybe, I mean, I'm sure some lucky people are raised where they examine negative emotions in a healthy way. But it seems like the prevailing sentiment in our society is to kind of just ignore or try to ignore negative emotions and keep a stiff upper lip, and then just keep going to work and act professional while you're at work, right? That's the big thing. We all have our jobs, and you're supposed to act professional no matter what. You're not supposed to allow your personal feelings to get in the way of your work. And so we just all spend so much time repressing emotions. And now with the pandemic, we're stuck inside, And a lot of us are having to face our emotions now because we don't have our usual outlets to distract us. And so I think that's part of why a lot of the turmoil that we're seeing in the country right now, there's a lot of repressed emotion that people are being forced to face, but a lot of us don't want to face it. We just try to keep repressing it, and then a lot of that's bubbling over into anger. There's still a lot of anger out in the air right now. So what I was talking about, that's what we need to do to address fear. Like whenever we notice that we have some kind of disproportional emotional response, that's usually a sign that there's some kind of repressed emotion somewhere that we need to examine. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to say about this topic. Any questions? Any thoughts?
And I say, I mean, there's reasonable fear.
Oh, sure.
I mean, it would be a bummer if you spent all your money and you had to lose your home because you threw so much into this. There's reasonable fear, and then like there's unreasonable fear that spider over there is going to kill me any minute. So it's interesting to parse it out, what is reasonable, and how some action or some change will ease the fear if it's reasonable.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
yeah. That's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, a lot of our fears are well founded. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be afraid right now with everything that's going on in the world. But all we can really do about anything is acknowledge our fears, and it can be helpful to kind of play out the worst case scenario, right? When we're facing some fear, really honestly look at what's the worst possible thing that could happen here, and then see really how bad that is, and is that something that we can recover from? Because I mean, we've all been through hard things in our life, and we've all recovered from them, and because there's so much that we can't plan for. I mean, unexpected always happens. Unexpected events, tragic events always happen, and all we can do is deal with them when they happen, and worrying about them ahead of time or ignoring that it's a possibility doesn't help anything. But so yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's important to acknowledge our real fears and face them, and then also just realize that if that worst case scenario happens, we'll deal with it when it happens. So yeah.
Yeah, I think attachment too is a word that comes up for me when I hear what you were saying. Like, I think that there's a certain attachment sometimes to an outcome, and there's fear that comes along with if that doesn't pan out the way we wanted to or feel we needed to. And I know for me, that is something that I have noticed in my life, because I tend to go to anger too. That's my sort of button when I'm feeling afraid or attached or something.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. We talked about detachment a couple weeks ago, but yeah, that's a great point also. And I mean, even though in the way I deal with a lot of fear is relying on my faith that things do work out the way they should in the end, even though it can be stressful and really unpleasant, miserable at times. It always, at least in my life so far, it's always turned out to be what I needed to go through at the time. So. Yeah. Great. Any other questions or comments?
We talked about attachment, and I puzzle over it. I mean, for example, as a person who like really pushed hard to get certain things to have a life out of poverty, they could say, well, you were too attached to it, or you pushed so hard it cost my health in many ways. But on the other hand, I was determined to get there, and happy when I did. It's And I'm not saying that to detach is a bad thing, but it seems so hip these days to say detach, detach, when you detach enough and you don't do anything. Or, it's, I'm sorry, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, but I'm challenging that. Um, and I don't have any answers. Yeah, I really don't.
Yeah, well, like all of these spiritual concepts and ideas, it's always a matter of balance. I mean, we can be detached and still have goals. We can be attached and still have plans and desires and things we want to have happen. Um, but I think, and like I was talking about today, anytime we want something, we also we have to be prepared for the possibility that we won't get it, because due to events or circumstances beyond our control. Um, but if we if we become too attached to any one particular outcome, then we're just setting ourselves up for pain and suffering in the future if we don't get that outcome. And so it's good and healthy and necessary to have goals and to pursue goals. Um, it's just it's it it can be it's healthier in the long run to be okay with not achieving the goal. I mean, if it happens due to circumstances totally out of your control, you could beat yourself up if you really want something and you did everything possible to get it, but you still don't due to circumstances that you can't control. If you're really attached to that outcome, you're going to suffer a lot.
Yeah.
And sometimes the way you think it's supposed to look isn't how it unfolds. And so you might be attached to like a certain thing that you think is the goal, but then life takes you in a circuitous route and you end up being in a place that you didn't even know you wanted to be, So it's,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of trust involved. And I think, like you're saying, Matt, you can have goals, but to not necessarily have expectations of how they're going to look, how they're going to present themselves.
Yeah. An ex-girlfriend of mine one time told me she liked to plant seeds. She thought of it as planting seeds. Like if there was something she wanted to have happen, she would work towards it. She was thinking of it more of like planting the seed and then just kind of stepping back. Because after you plant a seed, you have to allow it to grow. I mean, you do a bunch of work up front to plant it and get everything ready. And then you have to kind of just step back and let it grow and trust that it's going to grow. And sometimes it doesn't grow. And so I think that's a good way to approach goals and dreams in life, to move in a certain direction, plant that seed, work towards it, but then you have to allow it to sprout and allow it to grow in the way that it's going to grow according to the conditions. You can't plant an apple seed and hope that an orange tree grows from it. You have to plant the seed and then allow it to grow the way that it's going to grow in response to the circumstances. And sometimes it's going to grow in ways that you couldn't anticipate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's meditate again. If either of you want to use music, I put the Spotify playlist in the chat, or you can just sit in silence, whichever works for you. Oh, like you were saying, Gina, that how it works out. Sometimes it works out the way you didn't expect it. Well, since then, my phone battery's been fine, and so I don't actually need the phone. So in this case, it did all work out for the best. So yeah. All right, let's meditate.
Okay, so we're starting with the first horizon, is that?
Sure. Yeah, let's start with that one.
Okay.
Actually, let's skip to track number 2.
2?
Yeah. And for this meditation, let's meditate on the heart chakra. So let's find our comfortable seat, and let's imagine that we're holding our heart in front of our chest, cupping our heart in our hands. And as we inhale, let's breathe in love from the universe. And as we exhale, let's exhale that love into our heart. So we'll breathe in love from our surroundings and then exhale that love into our heart, filling our heart with love. If you'd like to use music, you can hit play now. Slowly start to deepen the inhale, bringing our awareness back into the physical. Great. So, the other topic I want to talk about tonight is kind of what I was doing before. So, what I talked about, so it's called, I don't know if you've heard of this concept of toxic positivity. It's also called spiritual bypassing in some circles. And it's the idea is when we use, hi, kitty.
I
The idea is when we use concepts or ideas from spirituality in unhealthy ways. And so what I described earlier is an example of that. I was using my faith that everything works out exactly the way it should to repress my fear of the future. And so that's an example of how we have to be careful with spiritual practices, how um, they can be applied in unhealthy ways. I mean, this can be happen with any of the topics we talk about, but and it's a very real thing. And uh, this people talk. There's a lot of people writing about this on Elephant Journal, where I'm very active right now, and because it can be used to propagate very unhealthy mindsets. I mean, especially for people that have a lot of repressed trauma, like real hardcore trauma. Sometimes taking a spiritual approach can just lead people to want to just totally ignore it, just try to act like they're healed, try to just tell themselves they're healed, when sometimes there's a lot of um, emotional trauma that needs to be addressed by a professional. It needs to be worked through with a counselor or a licensed therapist. And so it's just something to be aware of as you walk the spiritual path and as you develop spiritual ideas, and with regard to everything I'm talking about, that with everything in the spiritual path, it has to be applied in a balanced way, right? We can't, even with talking about detachment, like you were saying, Diane, detachment taken in the wrong way can just lead to dissociation from your life and hiding from your life and just ignoring problems. And that's never what we want to do. We never want to use the beautiful ideas from spirituality or from Eastern religions to cover over our emotions or just try to act like problems don't exist. So it's a fine line, it's a fine balance of believing everything will work out okay in the end versus being putting on the blinders and ignoring very real life circumstances. I think it'd be irresponsible for me to just pretend to just assume everything's going to be okay and spend money you know lavishly, um, just assuming it'll all be okay in the future. So it's a very fine balance, a tightrope that we have to walk in how we interpret and apply these spiritual teachings to our own lives. Are there any questions about that? Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Yeah, because yeah, it can be a tricky subject to navigate through our lives. How to react in a way that's healthy for us. It's not just how to get the most benefit from these ancient teachings that have a lot of very beneficial things to offer us, but they can also be applied in unhealthy ways if we're not careful. So, yeah, That's just all I wanted to say about that. Have you heard of that idea before about toxic positivity or spiritual bypassing? No.
I was wondering if it's like giving someone on the street $1 and thinking that you're so groovy and generous when it actually may be harming in the long run. That's what I'm hearing, that it's actually not such a great idea to just pass on a couple bucks. I'm confused about the whole thing, but does that seem like a possible idea about that?
Um, Possibly, yeah. Well, the whole homeless situation is, I mean, that's a huge, complicated issue, especially
Yeah.
in California. Well, my meditation teacher always used to encourage us to give money to homeless whenever we saw them, like even if because a lot of us are more fortunate, even if they do just take that money and buy drugs. um, yeah, I don't know. That's a tricky one. But I think especially with, so another example, or this whole, you may have seen stickers that would say like positive vibes only, right? So that sounds like a good thing, but if you take that to an unhealthy extreme, if you only allow yourself to think positive thoughts, you're going to wind up repressing a lot of emotions too. So that idea of, and that when we meditate, when we practice a spiritual path, bad things are still going to happen to us. I mean, you can practice all the daily positive affirmations you want and work on manifesting all of your dreams to come true, and they might, but still probably at some point bad things are still going to happen. That's just a part of life. I mean, you can't be happy all the time. There's always, that's the nature of the world. It's impermanent. Things are always, everything ends at some point. And so trying to,
Makes me think of the Abrahamic thing, which in a sick way, and it's not totally that, but if something bad happens, it's because you created the energy for it to come to you. It's your fault. I'm exaggerating, but you know that one.
mm-hmm.
That's no compassion there.
Right. Well, and that's also, I think, another um, example of kind of toxic spirituality. The idea that, uh, or I think a lot of people who have been victims of horrible things happening to them, that can be a way to just punish themselves more, right?
Yeah.
To think that you brought it on yourself. Something really horrible happens to you, and someone tells you, "Oh, you brought it on yourself with your negative thinking." It just starts this negative feedback loop and just makes everything worse.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, so all of these ideas are very, can be very tricky in a way, and very very subtle in how you can apply them to our lives in a healthy way. So it's just something to keep in mind. Yeah. Any other questions about anything in general, meditation in general?
There was a woman in Italy who had such tight jeans that she was knocked down and raped, and the judge said the man was innocent because he couldn't have gotten those jeans off himself. She must have helped. And every year at that ruling, that date, all of us at the university would wear jeans in protest, and I always dressed. And so I'd have to explain to my class, this is why I'm wearing jeans today.
Mm,
And I guess to some people it makes sense. Well, she must have asked for it because she wore tight jeans, or she
right.
must have helped. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a whole another, again, complicated issue.
yeah.
The gender dynamics in our country and in the world right now. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's meditate one more time.
Can I just ask one thing just to
Yeah.
touch on that? Like,
Mhm.
you're referring to the situation right now politically and just what's going on, and I don't quite know how to be in this time, right? Like I don't want to live in fear. I don't want to have hate in my heart for things that I feel are completely unjust, that are happening, and people that are so far removed from where my center is. And so it's like, I don't know how much to engage. Like, it's just a tricky time because the more you look at the news and find out what's happening, the more appalled you get on either side. I feel like, there's so much polarity that's going on. There's so much us against them. I don't know. I'm really struggling with it because I don't, I feel like I kind of stay in my little bubble then and see and talk to people that share my values, but that's not really the answer either. So I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Like, what do we do?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. And to properly answer that, I think would take more time than we have tonight. um,
Okay.
but
Maybe we can talk about that next week.
sure, yeah, well, that's actually something I've been thinking about a lot. And I wrote an article 2 weeks ago. It came out on Martin Luther King Day about this topic, about how even though there's horrible things have happened, we need to maintain love in our hearts for people on the other side, right? Even and so I'll give a short, brief answer if I can. Yeah, there's we don't. So horrible things have happened. The law has been broken, and whenever the law is broken, people need to be held accountable. But in terms of how we think about the whole rest of the country, right? There's a whole bunch of other voters, about half, no matter what side you're on, about half the country has the opposite views of you, right? And most of those people are just like us. They're trying to get by in life. They're trying to provide for their families, trying to provide for themselves. But their reactions to the current situation and their thoughts on the current situation arose in the same way that your thoughts or our thoughts arose. It's just the thoughts that come up in our brains are a combination of our internal personality responding to the events the circumstances that we find ourselves in. That's how all of us are. We're all just a combination of our innate tendencies and how we've been nurtured through life. And so that's how we can have compassion in our hearts for people that seem to have completely opposite values. They're not evil people for having these thoughts and having these feelings. They're they're having these thoughts and these feelings because of how they've been raised and how they were and the innate personality they were born with. So it's not their fault that they're having these thoughts. But what is wrong is how people, or what can be wrong is how people act on their thoughts, right? So that's whenever someone breaks the law or whenever someone treats another human as anything less than a human, that is definitely wrong and that we need to address. And when that happens, we need to hold people accountable for that. But at the same time, when we're seeking justice, we can do that from a place of love and compassion and try to seek fair justice rather than trying to find revenge, right? If we when we try to seek justice out of hate or out of anger, then we're looking for vengeance, right? We're not seeking justice. We want to make the other person suffer, and that's when it leads to unhealthy behaviors and just unproductive cycles of people lashing out and lashing back and re- seeking revenge on each other.
Yeah,
And
it's almost like you dig in your heels more than in some ways for your side,
also, I
that,
mean, whenever someone
yeah.
attacks you, we naturally dig in our heels and defend ourselves. And so if we want to change how people act and change how they think, it's much more useful, or it's much more likely that we can do that if we act out of a place of compassion and love, and understanding that we're in our hearts, we're all human, we're all people just trying to get by as best as we can. I mean, there are a few people, especially people in power, that are acting um, completely immorally, and those people need to be voted out of office or brought to justice. And but for for us peons, there's we can peacefully demonstrate. We can contact our congressman to try to, if I don't know, this seems like it doesn't really do any good, but I mean there are steps we can take to try to make things better without adding more hate and more anger into the world. Does that make sense as a short answer? And I know it's complicated, and it's, especially in these times, it's very difficult to maintain compassion for other people when there's so much hate being, so much anger being slung around in the media these days. But does that? I'll talk about this more next week because it's something that's been coming up a lot.
And maybe you could send out a link to the article that you wrote. Can you do that?
Sure. Mm-hmm. All right. I think it might be in last week's email if you have that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah. Great. So we're running out of time. Let's do one more meditation, then we can be on our way. Um, so for this meditation, we'll be similar to our last meditation, but and this time when we inhale, let's imagine we're inhaling that love into our hearts. And then as we exhale, let's imagine that we're broadcasting that love out to the world. Because as we were talking about, there's so much hate and anger. And so let's just try to spread some of the love that we've felt and cultivated here. Let's try to share that with the world in this next meditation. So if you'd like to use music, you can hit play now, and we'll come back in a few minutes. Slowly begin to deepen the inhale, bringing ourselves back into the body. So thanks for joining me this week.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about this topic next week because it's very important and it's what we're all dealing with right now. It's a very challenging time to be alive.
Thank you, Matt.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yep.
Bye, Diane.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Gina.
Bye.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everybody.